Hi, I'm Danielle Harper, and 3 weeks ago I discovered that while I was sobbing over my mother's casket, my own siblings were in the parking lot, dividing up money that belonged to me. $75,000, money my mother specifically left for me because I was the only one who visited her in the hospital, the only one who held her hand when the machines stopped beeping, the only one who actually grieved instead of calculating. But Victoria and Marcus thought they were smarter than a dying woman's wishes. They thought wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that felt like the world had shifted off its axis. I was in my Portland apartment, deep in the kind of sleep that only comes after pulling consecutive 14-hour days at the marketing firm where I'd been grinding toward a promotion for 18 months. The phone's shrill ring cut through my dreams like glass, and somehow, even before I answered, I knew my life was about to fracture into before and after. "Dani." My father's voice sounded hollow, unfamiliar. "You need to come home, your mother. She's gone." The words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Gone. Such a simple word for something so catastrophic. Mom had been battling high blood pressure for years, but she was only 54. She was supposed to have decades left. She was supposed to see me get married, supposed to meet her grandchildren, supposed to be there when I finally figured out what I wanted to do with my life beyond climbing corporate ladders that led nowhere meaningful. I drove the 2 hours from Portland to Riverside in a fog of disbelief, my hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. The coastal Oregon highway blurred past my windshield, evergreen trees standing like silent sentinels watching me race toward a grief I wasn't ready to carry. When I pulled into the driveway of 1847 Maple Ridge Drive, the house where I'd grown up looked smaller somehow, as if Mom's absence had already begun shrinking the world around us. Victoria's pristine white SUV was parked in Mom's usual spot, and Marcus's lifted truck dominated the driveway like he owned the place. I should have known that. I should have paid attention to how quickly they'd swooped in, how they were already moving through Mom's house like vultures picking over carrion. But I was drowning in my own sorrow, too devastated to notice the calculating gleam in their eyes, or the way they kept whispering in corners when they thought I wasn't looking. The next 3 days passed in a blur of casseroles from neighbors, flower arrangements that made the house smell like a funeral parlor, and endless decisions about services and burial plots and guest lists. I threw myself into the planning because activity felt better than standing still with my grief. I called Mom's friends, organized the memorial slideshow, picked out her favorite lavender dress for the Sir Victoria, and Marcus let me handle everything, claiming they were too emotional to deal with the details. Looking back, I realized they were perfectly content to let me exhaust myself with arrangements while they focused on more profitable pursuits. The funeral itself was a beautiful tragedy. Richardson Memorial Services had transformed their main chapel into something that would have made Mom smile, with white lilies and soft piano music, and warm lighting that made everyone look like they were glowing with grace. I sat in the front row between Dad and an empty space that should have been Mom's, listening to Pastor Williams talk about eternal rest and God's plan, wondering how anyone could plan for a heart to simply stop beating during morning coffee and crossword puzzles. I delivered the eulogy through tears that felt like they were coming from somewhere deeper than my chest. I talked about Mom's terrible jokes and her legendary pot roast and the way she never let anyone leave her house without a Tupperware container of leftovers. I shared the story about how she stayed up all night helping me finish my senior year history project on the Oregon Trail, complete with a miniature covered wagon we built from popsicle sticks and fabric scrap. The congregation laughed and cried in all the right places, and for a moment I felt like I was honoring her memory properly. But while I was pouring my heart out at that podium, while I was trying to capture 28 years of love and laughter and life lessons in a 10-minute speech, Victoria and Marcus were already 3 steps ahead in a game I didn't even know we were playing. They'd spent the previous evening going through Mom's papers, they claimed, trying to help Dad organize important documents. What they'd actually been doing was hunting for anything valuable, anything transferable, anything they could claim before I had a chance to understand what Mom had left behind. The reception at the community center was worse than the service itself. Grief has a way of settling into your bones once the adrenaline of ceremony wears off, and I felt like I was moving underwater while everyone else chatted over finger sandwiches and coffee. Miss Kim, our elderly Korean neighbor who'd been Mom's closest friend for 15 years, kept pressing my hands between hers and telling me stories about their morning walks and book club discussion. She mentioned something that didn't register at the time, something about Mom being worried about money and wanting to make sure I was taken care of, but the words floated past me like everything else that day. What I remember most clearly is the moment when I looked across the room and saw Victoria and Marcus huddled near the back exit with their phones out, typing furiously. They weren't grieving. They weren't mingling with the guests who'd come to pay their respect. They were conducting business while our mother's body was still warm in the ground. When I approached them asking if everything was okay, Victoria looked up with red-rimmed eyes that I mistook for sorrow but now recognize as exhaustion from staying up all night planning. "Just handling some logistics," she said, slipping her phone into her purse with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd perfected the art of deception. "You know how much paperwork there is when someone dies. We're trying to take some of the burden off Dad." Marcus nodded solemnly, playing his part in their performance. "The bank needed some information about Mom's accounts. We didn't want to bother you while you're dealing with everything else." Their concern felt genuine enough at the time. I was the youngest, the one who'd moved away for college and never really moved back. Victoria was the responsible older sister who'd stayed local, married her high school boyfriend, and produced 2 grandchildren who were the light of Mom's life. Marcus was the dutiful son who'd taken over Harper's hardware store when Dad's arthritis made lifting inventory boxes too painful. It made sense that they would handle the practical details while I was lost in emotional devastation. I thanked them for their thoughtfulness and went back to accepting condolences from people who wanted to share their favorite Linda Harper memory. I listened to stories about her volunteering at the animal shelter and her famous Christmas cookies, and the way she always remembered everyone's birthdays with handwritten cards. Each story felt like a small gift, a piece of my mother that would live on in other people's hearts even though she was gone from mine. The week after the funeral was when the real cruelty began. I'd taken bereavement leave from my job and was staying at Dad's house, helping him adjust to the echoing silence that followed Mom's absence. The woman had been the social coordinator of our family, the one who planned gatherings and remembered anniversaries and kept everyone connected. Without her, we were just 4 people who happened to share DNA, but didn't really know how to talk to each other. Dad spent most of his time in his workshop, building birdhouses with the same obsessive focus he'd once applied to running the hardware store. Victoria and Marcus came by daily, ostensibly to check on him, but really to continue their systematic excavation of Mom's belongings. They were efficient and methodical, sorting through jewelry boxes and file cabinets and desk drawers with the thoroughness of professional estate liquidators. I should have been suspicious when they insisted on handling Mom's banking and insurance paperwork themselves. I should have questioned why they needed her social security number and account information so urgently. But I was still floating in that strange bubble of early grief where normal life feels impossible and letting other people handle logistics seems like a mercy rather than a mistake. The first real warning sign came when I tried to access Mom's checking account to pay for the headstone we'd ordered. I'd offered to cover the cost since Dad was struggling with the funeral expenses, and I had Mom's debit card and PIN from when I'd helped her with errands during her last hospital stay. But when I tried to withdraw money at Pacific Northwest Credit Union, the teller looked at me with confusion and asked me to wait while she spoke with her manager. Angela Foster emerged from the back office with the kind of expression bank managers wear when they're about to deliver bad news. She was a woman in her 40s with carefully styled blonde hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She'd known our family for years through the hardware store's business account, so her formal tone immediately put me on edge. "I'm sorry, Miss Harper, but there seems to be some confusion about the account access. The primary beneficiaries have already initiated transfer procedures for your mother's accounts." The words hit me like a physical blow. Primary beneficiaries, transfer procedure. These weren't terms I'd expected to hear in connection with Mom's simple checking account that she'd used for grocery money and utility bills. I don't understand, I said, my voice sounding thin and distant even to my own ears. I'm her daughter. I should be able to access her accounts to pay for funeral expenses. Angela's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained professionally neutral. I understand this is a difficult time, but according to our records, Victoria Harper Mason and Marcus Harper were listed as the primary beneficiaries on your mother's life insurance policy and savings accounts. They completed the paperwork yesterday morning. The world tilted sideways. Life insurance policy. Savings accounts. Mom had never mentioned having substantial savings, and the idea that she'd excluded me from any inheritance felt impossible. She was the one who'd encouraged me to pursue my dreams in Portland, the one who'd sent care packages during my struggling years as a junior marketing associate, the one who'd always worried about my financial stability in an expensive city. I asked Angela to print out whatever information she could legally share, my hands shaking as I tried to process what was happening. The documents she handed me were sparse but devastating. Mom's life insurance policy through Dad's old union benefits was worth $75,000. Her savings account, which I'd thought contained maybe a few $100s for emergencies, held another $8,000. All of it had been claimed by my siblings. The drive back to Dad's house felt like the longest 2 miles of my life. I kept staring at the papers on my passenger seat, trying to make sense of numbers that didn't add up to anything I understood about my family or my place in it. $83,000, more money than I'd ever had in my bank account at one time. Money that could have paid off my student loans, given me a down payment for a house, provided the security I'd been working 16-hour days to achieve, but more than the money itself was what it represented. Mom had named Victoria and Marcus as beneficiaries, which meant either she'd deliberately excluded me, or someone had convinced her to change her arrangements without telling me. Given how close we'd been, especially during her final months, the first option seemed impossible, which left the second option, and that possibility made my stomach churn with a mixture of grief and rage I'd never experienced before. I found Dad in his workshop, sanding a piece of cedar with the same methodical strokes he'd been repeating for hours. Sawdust covered his hands and forearms, and his face had the empty expression of someone trying to stay busy enough to avoid thinking. When I showed him the papers from the bank, he looked confused rather than surprised. I don't know anything about insurance policies, he said, setting down his sandpaper and wiping his hands on his jeans. Your mother handled all the financial stuff. She was always better with numbers and planning than I was. His genuine bewilderment confirmed my worst suspicion. Dad wasn't part of whatever had happened with Mom's money. He was as clueless as I was, which meant Victoria and Marcus had orchestrated this themselves. They'd either manipulated Mom into changing her beneficiaries, or they'd forged documents, or they'd found some other way to steal what was meant for me. That night I lay in my childhood bedroom staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars Mom had helped me stick to the ceiling when I was 10 years old. The house felt different without her presence, emptier and colder, like a movie set after filming wraps. I could hear Dad moving around downstairs, his footsteps heavy and aimless, and I wondered if he was feeling the same devastating loneliness that was threatening to swallow me whole. But underneath the grief was something else, something harder and more focused than sadness. My siblings had stolen from me while I was burying our mother. They'd used my devastating grief as cover for their greed, counting on my emotional devastation to keep me from asking questions or demanding answers. They'd turned the worst day of my life into an opportunity for profit, and that realization was beginning to burn through my sorrow like acid through cloth. I thought about all the times over the years when I'd felt like an outsider in my own family. The Christmas mornings when Victoria's children got the expensive gifts while I received practical items like socks and gift cards. The family dinners where Marcus and Dad discussed hardware store business while I sat silent, my marketing career dismissed as something frivolous and urban. The countless occasions when I'd driven down from Portland for birthdays and holidays, only to feel like I was interrupting some club I'd never been invited to join. Now I understood that the exclusion hadn't been accidental or unconscious. It had been deliberate and strategic, a long-term campaign to position me as the outsider so that when opportunities arose to benefit from my absence, they'd already established the narrative that I didn't really belong. I was the daughter who'd moved away, the sister who was too busy with her career to visit regularly, the family member who couldn't be counted on when things got difficult, except none of that was true. I'd been the one who drove down every weekend during Mom's final months, sitting with her during chemotherapy sessions and doctor's appointments, while Victoria was busy with her children's soccer schedules and Marcus was focused on expanding the hardware store's inventory. I'd been the one who helped Mom organize her medications and drove her to physical therapy and spent hours listening to her fears about dying before she got to see her grandchildren graduate from high school. The more I thought about it, the clearer the pattern became. Victoria and Marcus had spent years carefully cultivating their image as the devoted local children while painting me as the selfish daughter who'd abandoned the family for big city dreams. They'd been positioning themselves as the rightful heirs to whatever Mom left behind, and they'd used my physical distance and career focus as evidence that I didn't need or deserve whatever inheritance she might have planned. But they'd miscalculated in one crucial way. They'd assumed I would be too grief-stricken and too overwhelmed to investigate what had happened to Mom's money. They'd counted on my devastation to keep me passive and compliant, just as it always had during family conflict. They'd expected me to accept their explanations and retreat back to Portland with my sorrow, leaving them free to enjoy their windfall without interference. What they didn't realize was that grief and rage could coexist, and that sometimes loss creates a clarity that's sharper and more dangerous than happiness ever could be. I wasn't just mourning my mother anymore. I was mourning the family I'd thought I belonged to, the siblings I'd believed loved me despite our differences, the future I'd imagined where we'd support each other through Dad's aging, and our own families and all the milestones Mom wouldn't be there to witness. That version of my family had never really existed. It had been a fiction I'd maintained through willful blindness and desperate hope, a story I'd told myself to avoid confronting the truth about my place in the Harper family hierarchy. But now the fiction was shattered, and I was left with a choice. I could retreat into grief and let them get away with their theft, or I could fight back with the same calculated precision they'd used to steal from me. As the glow in the dark stars faded with the approaching dawn, I made my decision. Victoria and Marcus thought they were smarter than their grieving little sister. They thought they'd planned this perfectly, exploiting my absence and my sorrow to claim what wasn't there. But they'd forgotten that the same intelligence that had earned me a marketing degree and a successful career could be applied to other challenges. They wanted to play games with my inheritance. Fine, but they were about to learn that I'd inherited more than money from Mom.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I'd inherited her stubborn streak and her sense of justice, and her absolute refusal to let bullies win without a fight. And unlike them, I wasn't going to let emotion cloud my judgment or make me sloppy. I was going to be smart about this. I was going to be patient, and I was going to make sure that when the truth finally came out, everyone would know exactly who Victoria and Marcus Harper really were underneath their masks of family devotion. The morning after my bank discovery, I woke with the kind of clarity that only comes after a night of restless planning. While Dad shuffled around the kitchen making his terrible coffee, I sat at Mom's antique writing desk in the living room, surrounded by the detritus of a life interrupted. Her reading glasses still sat folded beside a half-finished crossword puzzle, and her favorite pen lay uncapped next to a grocery list that would never be completed. But hidden among these everyday remnants was something I'd overlooked in my initial grief. Mom had always been a saver, not just of money, but of everything that might someday prove important. She kept every warranty, every receipt, every document that crossed her path, filing them away in an organizational system that seemed chaotic to outsiders but made perfect sense to her methodical mind. While Victoria and Marcus had focused on obvious financial documents, they'd ignored the boxes of what they considered Mom's pack rat tendencies. I started with the shoebox labeled Important Tapers 2019-2020. Inside was a treasure trove of documentation that painted a very different picture than the one my siblings had presented. Bank statements going back 5 years showed regular deposits that didn't match Dad's disability pension or the modest profits from the hardware store. Mom had been receiving monthly payments from something called Pacific Northwest Life Services, amounts that started small but had grown to nearly $800 a month by the time of her death. The discovery led me deeper into her filing system, and that's when I found the manila envelope marked for Danielle only, in Mom's distinctive handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it, not from grief this time, but from anticipation. Inside were photocopies of insurance policies, savings account statements, and investment documents I'd never known existed. But the most shocking discovery was a handwritten letter dated just 3 months before her death. "My dearest Dani," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've probably discovered that your brother and sister have tried to claim what I left for you. I'm writing this because I know them better than they think I do, and I've seen how they talk about you when they think I'm not listening. They believe you don't need help because you have a good job and live in the city. But I know how hard you've worked for everything you have, and I want to make sure you're taken care of." The letter went on to explain that Mom had been quietly building a nest egg specifically for me, using money from a small inheritance she'd received from her own mother years earlier. She'd invested it carefully, letting it grow over time, and had structured her accounts so that I would be the sole beneficiary. The insurance policy and savings account that Victoria and Marcus had claimed were supposed to be split 3 ways among her children, but the real inheritance, the money that was meant specifically for me, was hidden in investment accounts they didn't know about. "The account numbers are in the safety deposit box at First National," the letter continued. "The key is taped under the bottom drawer of my jewelry box behind the felt lining. Your siblings don't know about this account because it was never listed in the paperwork they've seen. The financial advisor's name is Patricia Wells, and she has instructions to contact you directly when I'm gone. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you about this while I was alive, but I was afraid Victoria would convince me to change my mind if she knew. She can be very persuasive when she wants something." I sat back in Mom's chair, holding the letter like it was made of spun glass. She'd seen what I'd been too naive or too hopeful to recognize, that my siblings viewed me as competition rather than family. More than that, she'd taken steps to protect me from their greed, creating a financial safety net that they couldn't touch because they didn't know it existed. The jewelry box sat on Mom's dresser where it had for as long as I could remember, a carved wooden treasure chest that had belonged to her grandmother. I'd looked through it countless times as a child, trying on her costume jewelry, and listening to stories about which pieces came from which relatives. But I'd never thought to examine the construction of the box itself. The bottom drawer required some gentle prying to remove completely, but once I did, I could see where the felt lining had been carefully lifted and retaped. The safety deposit box key was exactly where Mom said it would be, along with a small piece of paper with account numbers and passwords written in her careful script. She'd thought of everything, planning for a future where her own children might betray each other over money. Patricia Wells' office was located in a modest building downtown, sandwiched between a used bookstore and a craft shop that specialized in coastal souvenirs. The financial advisor herself was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested she'd navigated plenty of family financial drama over the years. When I called to schedule an appointment, mentioning Mom's name in the letter, her voice immediately warmed with recognition. "Danielle, I've been expecting your call," she said. "Your mother spoke about you often. She was very proud of your independence, but she was also worried about making sure you had security for the future. She asked me specifically to wait until after her funeral before reaching out, because she wanted you to have time to grieve before dealing with financial matters." The meeting itself felt surreal. Patricia's office was filled with family photos and certificates of achievement, the kind of space designed to make people feel comfortable discussing their deepest financial fears and hopes. She pulled out a thick folder marked with my name and began explaining the investments Mom had made on my behalf over the past 8 years. "Your mother was remarkably disciplined about this," Patricia explained, spreading documents across her desk. "She started with the inheritance from her mother, about $15,000, and added to it regularly. She was particularly interested in conservative growth investments, things that would build value steadily without too much risk. She wanted to make sure that whatever happened with the economy or the family business, you'd have something solid to fall back on. The numbers on the statements made my head spin. What had started as a modest inheritance had grown to nearly $47,000 through careful investment and regular contributions. Combined with Mom's personal savings that she'd earmarked specifically for me, the total came to just over $60,000. It wasn't the $75,000 that Victoria and Marcus had stolen, but it was substantial enough to change my life in meaningful ways. More importantly, it was mine, legally, ethically, and morally mine in a way that left no room for interpretation or family politics. Mom had been careful to structure everything so that I was the only person who could access these accounts, and she'd worked with Patricia to ensure that all the documentation was ironclad. My siblings couldn't claim ignorance or confusion or family tradition. They simply had no claim to money that had never been intended for them, but Patricia had more information to share. Details that shifted my understanding of the situation even further. Mom hadn't just been saving money for me, she'd been documenting Victoria and Marcus's behavior for years. The folder contained printouts of emails where they discussed her finances, copies of documents they'd asked her to sign, and even recordings of conversations where they pressured her to change her will. Your mother was more tech-savvy than people gave her credit for, Patricia said with a slight smile. She learned how to use her phone's recording feature specifically to document these interactions. She was building a case in essence to protect you from exactly what's happening now. The recordings were devastating. In one, Victoria could be heard explaining why Mom should exclude me from her inheritance, because I was financially successful enough not to need it. In another, Marcus outlined his plans for using inheritance money to expand the hardware store, treating Mom's future death as a business opportunity rather than a family tragedy. Most damning of all was a conversation where they discussed manipulating the insurance beneficiary forms while Mom was recovering from a minor surgery and wasn't thinking clearly. She was coherent enough to record them without their knowledge, Patricia noted, but vulnerable enough that they thought they could take advantage of her. Your mother was sharper than they realized, and she was documenting everything because she suspected they might try something like this. I left Patricia's office with copies of all the documentation and a clear understanding of my legal position. Not only did I have access to money that Victoria and Marcus couldn't touch, but I had evidence of their systematic manipulation of a vulnerable elderly woman. They'd committed elder abuse, insurance fraud, and possibly several other crimes, in their quest to steal what they thought was rightfully theirs. The drive back to Dad's house gave me time to process the implications of what I'd learned. My siblings hadn't just stolen my inheritance, they'd spent years grooming Mom for this moment, slowly convincing her to doubt my place in the family while positioning themselves as her primary caregivers and support. They'd used her love for her grandchildren and her concerns about the family business to justify their claims on her money, all while planning to exclude me from benefits that were supposed to be shared equally. But they'd made a crucial mistake in their calculation. They'd assumed that Mom was as naive and trusting as they wanted her to be, that she wouldn't see through their manipulation or take steps to protect herself and me from their greed. They'd underestimate her intelligence and her awareness of their true motives, and that underestimation was going to cost them everything. I found Dad in his workshop again, this time attempting to repair an old birdhouse that had been damaged in a recent storm. His hands moved slowly but steadily, muscle memory guiding him through familiar motions, while his mind clearly wrestled with thoughts he couldn't quite organize. When I showed him the documents Patricia had given me, his reaction was immediate and visceral. "I don't understand," he said, setting down his tools and studying the investment statements with confusion. "Your mother never told me about any of this. We always shared everything when it came to money." His bewilderment was genuine, and it confirmed something I'd begun to suspect. Mom had kept these accounts secret, not just from Victoria and Marcus, but from Dad as well. She'd known that his trusting nature and his desire to avoid family conflict would make him vulnerable to their manipulation, so she'd protected him by keeping him ignorant of details they might try to extract from him. She was protecting all of us, I explained gently. She knew Victoria and Marcus were planning something, and she didn't want to put you in a position where you'd have to choose sides or keep secrets from your own children. Dad's face cycled through a range of emotions as he processed the implication. Confusion gave way to hurt, which transformed into anger as he realized how thoroughly his older children had deceived him. He'd believed their claims about handling Mom's affairs out of love and duty, never questioning why they were so eager to take on financial responsibilities they'd previously shown no interest in managing. "They made me sign papers," he said slowly, his voice heavy with realization. "They said it was just to transfer Mom's checking account to help with funeral expenses. But now I'm wondering what else was in those documents. They brought everything to me at once, said it was too complicated to go through piece by piece." The revelation added another layer to my siblings' deception. They'd not only manipulated Mom's trust and exploited her vulnerability, but they'd also taken advantage of Dad's grief and confusion to get his signature on documents he didn't fully understand. They'd turned our parents' trusting natures against them, using love and family loyalty as weapons in their campaign of financial fraud. That evening, I called Chloe Martinez, my best friend and co-worker who'd been checking on me regularly since Mom's death. Chloe was a paralegal who'd left the legal field to pursue marketing but still maintained connections with attorneys throughout Portland. More importantly, she was one of the few people who knew my family well enough to understand the dynamics at play. "They did what?" she said when I finished explaining the situation. "Dani, that's not just theft, that's elder abuse. Your mom was basically documenting a criminal conspiracy, and they have no idea the evidence exists." Chloe's legal background kicked in immediately. She started asking questions about the recordings, the documentation, and the timeline of events that would be relevant if I decided to pursue criminal charges or civil litigation. But she also understood the emotional complexity of the situation, in ways that a stranger might not. "The question is what you want to accomplish," she said. "Do you want your money back? Do you want them prosecuted? Do you want the family to know what really happened? Because depending on your goals, there are different strategies that might work better." Her questions forced me to think beyond my immediate anger and hurt to consider what justice actually looked like in this situation. The money Victoria and Marcus had stolen was significant, but it wasn't enough to ruin me financially. The real damage was emotional and relational. The destruction of trust and family bonds that had already been strained by years of subtle exclusion and dismissal. What I wanted, I realized, was accountability. I wanted Victoria and Marcus to face consequences for their actions, and I wanted everyone who'd attended Mom's funeral to know that while I was grieving, my siblings were calculated. I wanted Dad to understand that the children he'd raised to value honesty and family loyalty had betrayed those values in the most fundamental way possible. But I also wanted something else, something that surprised me with its intensity. I wanted to honor Mom's memory by ensuring that her final act of love and protection wasn't wasted. She'd spent years quietly building a safety net for me, documenting evidence of my siblings' true nature, and creating legal protections to ensure I'd be taken care of after she was gone. The least I could do was make sure her efforts mattered. Over the next several days, I developed a plan that would accomplish all of these goals while minimizing the risk to myself and Dad. The key was patience and precise timing, two qualities that grief and anger made difficult to maintain, but that were essential for the kind of justice I was seeking. I needed to let Victoria and Marcus believe they'd gotten away with their scheme while I quietly gathered additional evidence and prepared for a confrontation they wouldn't see coming. The estate reading was scheduled for the following Friday, exactly 2 weeks after Mom's funeral. Victoria had volunteered to coordinate with Thomas Brennan, the estate attorney, ostensibly to spare Dad and me the additional stress of legal proceedings. At the time, I'd been grateful for her offer to handle the logistics. Now I understood that she wanted to control the narrative and the timeline, ensuring that any discussion of Mom's assets would focus on the accounts they'd already claimed, rather than any inheritance she might have intended for me. They'd made another crucial error in their plan. By positioning themselves as the helpful children managing difficult details for their grieving family, they'd created expectations about their character and motives that would make their deception even more shocking when it was revealed. Everyone who attended the reading would be expecting to see devoted siblings sharing their mother's modest estate equitably, not criminals who'd exploited a dying woman's trust for personal gain. I spent the week leading up to the reading carefully organizing all of my documentation. Patricia Wells agreed to attend as my financial advisor, bringing copies of all the investment records and Mom's correspondence about her intentions for the money. I also arranged for Angela Foster from Pacific Northwest Credit Union to provide official statements about the timing and nature of the benefit claims Victoria and Marcus had filed, but the most important preparation was emotion. I had to find a way to channel my anger and hurt into something more strategic, to transform my grief into a weapon that could cut through their lies without destroying me in the process. This meant accepting that the family I'd thought I belonged to had never really existed, that the love and loyalty I'd believed we shared had been largely one-sided from the beginning. It also meant acknowledging that no matter how satisfying it might be to expose their crimes, nothing I did would bring Mom back or repair the damage they'd done to our family relationship. Justice wasn't going to heal the fundamental betrayal, or restore the trust that had been shattered by their greed, but it might prevent them from hurting Dad or anyone else who trusted them in the future. The night before the reading, I sat in Mom's chair again, surrounded by the evidence of her love and her wisdom. She'd known this day would come, had prepared for it with the same careful attention she'd brought to everything important in her life. She'd trusted me to be strong enough to handle the truth about my siblings, and smart enough to use the tools she'd given me to protect myself and honor her memory. As I reviewed the documents one final time, I found a handwritten note tucked into the back of the investment folder, something I'd missed in my initial examination. It was dated just a week before her death, and the message was brief but powerful. Dani, if you're reading this, it means they did exactly what I thought they would do. Don't be sad about learning who they really are. Be grateful that you're strong enough and smart enough to see the truth and act on it. You are my greatest achievement, not because of what you've accomplished, but because of who you've chosen to be despite the family you were born into. Make me proud. I folded the note carefully and placed it in my purse, next to the recording device I'd borrowed from Chloe. Tomorrow Victoria and Marcus would discover that their little sister had learned more from Mom than they'd ever realized. They'd stolen my inheritance, but they'd also given me something far more valuable, absolute clarity about who they were and what I needed to do to protect myself from. The game they'd started at Mom's funeral was about to end, and this time, I was going to be the one writing the rules. Friday morning arrived with the kind of gray Oregon drizzle that makes everything look muted and somber. Perfect weather for what I had planned. I dressed carefully in the navy blue suit I'd worn to Mom's funeral, not out of sentiment, but because I wanted Victoria and Marcus to remember that day when everything started to unravel for them. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same outfit I'd worn while grieving would be what I wore while delivering justice. The estate reading was scheduled for 10 a.m. at Thomas Brennan's office, a converted Victorian house downtown that had been turned into a legal practice sometime in the 19th. The building still retained its residential charm, with hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot, and tall windows that let in the filtered morning light. Under different circumstances, it might have felt cozy and reassuring. Today, it felt like a courtroom where I would finally present my case. I arrived 15 minutes early, as I always did for important meetings, and found Patricia Wells already waiting in the small reception area. She'd dressed professionally but warmly, understanding that her role today was part financial advisor and part witness to a family confrontation that had been building for years. Her presence gave me confidence, a reminder that I wasn't walking into this alone or unprepared. Dad arrived next, looking uncomfortable in the same black suit he'd worn to Mom's funeral. His arthritis was bothering him. I could tell from the way he favored his left hand and moved more slowly than usual. The stress of the past 2 weeks had aged him, carved new lines around his eyes and mouth that spoke of sleepless nights and unanswered questions about his children's behavior. I still don't understand why we need a formal reading, he said quietly, settling into one of the waiting room chairs with a slight wince. Your mother never had much besides the house and some savings. This all seems so official for such a simple estate. His confusion was genuine, and it reminded me how thoroughly Victoria and Marcus had managed the information flow since Mom's death. They'd convinced him that the estate was straightforward while simultaneously working behind the scenes to claim everything of value for themselves. They'd used his grief and his trusting nature against him, just as effectively as they'd used mine. Victoria arrived at exactly 10 o'clock, bringing with her the kind of controlled energy that suggested she'd been preparing for this moment all week. She'd dressed in a cream-colored blazer and matching skirt that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, an outfit that projected both respectability and success. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup was flawless despite the early hour. She looked like someone who belonged in boardrooms and country clubs, not someone who'd spent the last 2 weeks systematically defrauding her own family. Marcus followed 5 minutes later, apologizing for his tardiness and blaming traffic from the hardware store. He was wearing his good khakis and a button-down shirt that still had visible creases from the package, the kind of outfit he reserved for church and important business meeting. His wedding ring caught the light as he shook hands with Patricia, and I found myself wondering what his wife thought about his recent windfall or if she even knew where the money had come from. Thomas Brennan emerged from his office looking every inch the small-town attorney, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an air of scholarly authority. He'd been practicing law in Riverside for over 30 years and had handled estate matters for dozens of local families, including the Harpers when my grandparents had died. His experience showed in the way he managed the room, greeting everyone warmly while maintaining the professional distance necessary for difficult family discussion. "Before we begin," he said, settling behind his mahogany desk with a thick folder in front of him, "I want to express my condolences again on Linda's passing. She was a remarkable woman who cared deeply about her family's welfare. I think you'll find that her final arrangements reflect that care and consideration." Victoria and Marcus exchanged a look that might have seemed like shared grief to anyone who didn't know what I knew, but I could see the calculation behind their expressions, the way they were mentally reviewing their strategy and preparing to play their roles as the responsible children who'd handled all the difficult details while their younger sister was too overwhelmed to help. Brennan opened the folder and began reading from Mom's will in the measured cadence of someone who'd performed this ritual countless times. The document itself was fairly standard, with provisions for Dad to retain the house and a modest monthly allowance from Mom's pension benefit. Her personal belongings were to be divided equally among her 3 children, with specific items designated for her grandchildren. But then came the section that Victoria and Marcus had been anticipating, the part about financial assets and insurance benefits. Brennan's voice remained steady and professional as he read Mom's instructions regarding the life insurance policy and savings accounts that my siblings had already claimed. "To my children Victoria Harper Mason and Marcus Robert Harper, I leave the proceeds of my Northwestern Mutual life insurance policy to be divided equally between them, as well as the contents of my primary savings account at Pacific Northwest Credit Union. These funds are intended to help with immediate expenses following my death and to provide some financial security during the transition period." Victoria nodded solemnly, playing her part perfectly. Marcus reached over to squeeze Dad's shoulder, a gesture of comfort that might have seemed touching if I didn't know it was calculated theater. They were both waiting for Brennan to conclude the reading so they could express their gratitude for Mom's generosity and their commitment to using the money responsibly. But Brennan wasn't finished. He turned to a new page in the folder, one that clearly contained information my siblings hadn't expected to hear. "However," he continued, his voice taking on a slightly different tone, "Linda also established several additional financial arrangements that are not part of the primary estate, but which she specifically requested be disclosed during this reading." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Victoria's confident expression flickered momentarily, and Marcus stopped mid-gesture, his hand still resting on Dad's shoulder, but his attention now completely focused on the attorney's words. "To my daughter Danielle Marie Harper," Brennan read, "I leave the entirety of my investment portfolio managed by Patricia Wells Financial Services, including all growth and accumulated interest through the date of my death. These funds represent money I inherited from my own mother and have been saving specifically for Danielle's future security." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the old buildings settling around us, wood and nails adjusting to changes in temperature and humidity. Dad looked confused, turning to stare at me as if I might be able to explain something he didn't understand. Victoria had gone very still, her hands folded in her lap with the kind of rigid control that suggested she was fighting to maintain her composure. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice carefully modulated to sound reasonable rather than accusatory. "I'm sorry, Mr. Brennan, but I think there might be some confusion here. Mom never mentioned any investment portfolio to us, and we've been handling all of her financial affairs since she got sick." Brennan looked at him over his glasses with the patient expression of someone who dealt with surprised heirs many times before. "There's no confusion, Mr. Harper. Your mother was very specific about keeping these arrangements separate from her primary estate. She worked with Ms. Wells for several years to ensure that these funds would be properly managed and transferred according to her wish." Patricia stepped forward then, her voice warm but professional as she addressed the room. "Linda began working with my firm 8 years ago when she received an inheritance from her mother's estate. She was very clear that she wanted to build something substantial for Danielle's future, separate from any other family financial planning." Victoria finally found her voice, though it came out tighter than her usual controlled tone. 8 years. She never said anything about working with a financial advisor. We would have known if she was making regular investment contributions. The accusation was implicit but clear. She was suggesting that either Patricia or I was lying about the timeline and the nature of Mom's financial arrangement. It was exactly the kind of challenge I'd expected, and I was ready for it. "Actually," I said, speaking for the first time since the reading had begun, "Mom was very careful about documenting her intentions and her reasons for keeping these investments private. She left detailed explanations that I think everyone should hear." I reached into my purse and pulled out the digital recorder Chloe had lent me, setting it on Brennan's desk where everyone could see it clearly. The device was small and unobtrusive, but its presence immediately changed the dynamic in the room. Victoria and Marcus both stiffened, their expressions shifting from confusion to something approaching alarm. "Before we listen to Mom's own words," I continued, "I think it's important for everyone to understand the full scope of what's been happening since her death. Patricia, would you mind sharing the timeline of the insurance claim?" Patricia consulted her notes and spoke with the precision of someone presenting evidence. "Victoria Harper Mason and Marcus Harper filed claims on Linda's life insurance policy and savings accounts on the morning of March 15th. Exactly 18 hours after Linda's death was officially recorded. The paperwork was submitted before the funeral home had even finalized the service arrangements." Dad's face went pale as the implications sank in. 18 hours. While I was making phone calls to relatives and choosing flowers and writing a eulogy, his older children were already at the bank claiming money that hadn't even been distributed yet. The timing alone was damning, but there was so much more to reveal. "That's not unusual," Marcus said quickly, his voice defensive now rather than reasonable. "There are always financial obligations after someone dies. We were trying to make sure Dad didn't have to worry about immediate expenses. The explanation might have been plausible if I didn't have evidence to the contrary." I pressed play on the recorder, and Mom's voice filled the room with startling clarity. She'd made this recording just 6 weeks before her death, when she was still mobile and sharp despite her declining health. "I'm making this recording because I need people to understand my intentions regarding my financial arrangements for my children," Mom's voice said, as clear and determined as I remember. "I love all my children, but I've become aware that Victoria and Marcus have been discussing my death as a financial opportunity rather than a family tragedy." Victoria shot to her feet as if she'd been electrocuted. "This is ridiculous, Danielle. You can't seriously expect us to sit here and listen to recordings that could have been made by anyone." Mom was on medications that affected her judgment toward the end, but Mom's voice continued, addressing that exact concern with the kind of foresight that only made her planning more devastating. "I know some people might question my mental state when they hear this, so I want to be clear that I'm recording this on March 2nd, 2024, after my regular appointment with Dr. Peterson. I am not on any medications that affect my cognitive function, and I am making these statements of my own free will." The recording went on to detail specific conversations Mom had overheard between Victoria and Marcus, including their discussion about convincing her to change her beneficiary designations, and their calculations about how much money they could expect to inherit. She quoted them almost verbatim, describing scenarios where they'd talked about my supposed financial success as justification for excluding me from any inheritance. Victoria told Marcus that Danielle doesn't need help because she has a good job, and no family responsibilities. Mom's voice continued with quiet sadness. Marcus agreed and said they should make sure the money goes to people who really need it, meaning themselves. They seemed to have forgotten that I was sitting in the next room and could hear every word. The effect on my siblings was immediate and devastating. Victoria sank back into her chair as if her legs couldn't support her anymore, while Marcus had gone completely white except for 2 bright spots of color high on his cheekbone. They'd been caught not just in their theft but in their callous disregard for both Mom's feelings and my place in the family. But the recording wasn't finished. Mom had documented multiple conversations over several weeks, building a comprehensive case against my siblings that went far beyond simple greed. She'd recorded them discussing Dad's finances and their plans to convince him to sell the house so they could split the proceeds. She'd captured Victoria explaining how they could contest any will provisions that didn't favor them by claiming Mom had been mentally incompetent during her final month. Most damning of all was a conversation where they discussed the timing of their inheritance claims, with Marcus specifically stating that they needed to file paperwork immediately after Mom's death to prevent me from interfering with their plan. They'd known exactly what they were doing and had planned their deception down to the hour. When the recording finally ended, the silence in the room was oppressive. Dad looked like he'd aged another 10 years in the space of 30 minutes, his face gray with shock and disappointment. Brennan was taking notes with the careful attention of someone who understood the legal implications of what he'd just heard. Patricia remained professionally composed, but I could see the satisfaction in her eyes at watching Mom's final plan unfold exactly as she'd intended. Victoria tried one more desperate gambit, her voice shaking now despite her efforts to maintain control. Even if those recordings are legitimate, they don't change the fact that Mom named us as beneficiaries on her insurance policy. We filed those claims legally and in good faith. This was the moment I'd been building toward, the culmination of weeks of careful investigation and strategic planning. I reached into my folder and pulled out the photocopied documents Angela Foster had provided, spreading them across Brennan's desk so everyone could see the dates and signatures clearly. "Actually," I said, allowing myself a small smile for the first time all morning, "the beneficiary forms you submitted weren't the ones Mom originally filed. Patricia, would you mind explaining the discrepancy?" Patricia opened her own folder and pulled out a document that made Victoria gasp audibly. It was a photocopy of the original insurance beneficiary form dated 3 years earlier and clearly listing all 3 Harper children as equal beneficiaries. Mom's signature was witness and notarized, leaving no question about its authenticity. "Linda filed this form in 2021 when she first started working with my firm," Patricia explained. "She wanted all her children to be treated equally in terms of her insurance benefit. The form that Victoria and Marcus used to claim the full policy amount was filed just 6 weeks before Linda's death, at a time when she was recovering from pneumonia and taking medications that affected her cognitive function. The trap was complete. Not only had Victoria and Marcus stolen money that was supposed to be shared equally, but they'd done so using documents they'd manipulated while Mom was too sick to understand what she was signing. They'd committed insurance fraud, elder abuse, and probably several other crimes in their systematic campaign to exclude me from my own mother's estate." Marcus tried to stand up, his movements jerky and uncontrolled as panic finally overtook his careful composure. "We didn't know about any original forms. Mom asked us to help her update her paperwork, and we just filled out what she told us to. But I had evidence for that claim too." I pulled out my phone and queued up another recording, this one made by Mom just 2 days before her death, when she was barely conscious but still aware enough to understand what was happening around her. "They came again today," Mom's weak voice whispered through the phone's speaker. "Victoria brought papers for me to sign. She said it was just to make things easier for Dad, but I could see Marcus in the hallway with his phone out, like he was timing something. I signed what they put in front of me because I was too tired to fight. But I knew it wasn't right. I hope Danielle finds this recording. I hope she knows I never wanted to exclude her from anything." The recording was brief, but it captured something that transcended mere evidence. It was the sound of a dying woman being betrayed by her own children, manipulated during her final moments by people she'd loved and trusted her entire life. The emotional weight of it was crushing, and I could see that even Victoria and Marcus were affected by hearing Mom's pain in her own voice. Dad finally spoke, his voice hollow with grief that went beyond Mom's death. to encompass the destruction of his faith and his older children. How could you do this? How could you take advantage of your own mother when she was dying? Neither Victoria nor Marcus had an answer for that question, because there was no answer that could justify their actions or restore the trust they'd shattered. They'd revealed themselves to be exactly what Mom had feared they were, people who valued money more than family, who saw her death as an opportunity, rather than a tragedy, who were willing to steal from their own sister while she was burying the woman who'd given them life. Brennan cleared his throat and spoke with the authority of someone who'd practiced law long enough to recognize criminal behavior when he saw it. Based on what we've heard today, I believe there are grounds for both civil and criminal action regarding the insurance claims and the manipulation of estate documents. The evidence suggests a pattern of elder abuse and financial fraud that goes well beyond simple family disputes over inheritance. Victoria finally broke, her careful composure cracking completely as she realized the full scope of what she was facing. We didn't mean for it to happen this way. We thought Danielle had enough, and we needed the money more. The hardware store has been struggling, and I have college funds to think about for the kids. Her admission was everything I'd hoped for, and everything I'd dreaded. She was confessing to exactly what Mom had accused them of, treating her death as a business opportunity, and my financial situation as justification for their theft. But she was also revealing the desperation and poor judgment that had led to this moment, the human weaknesses that had transformed family love into criminal greed. Marcus tried a different approach, appealing directly to Dad with the kind of emotional manipulation they'd probably been using for years. Dad, you know we love this family. We were just trying to make sure everyone was taken care of. Maybe we made some mistakes, but our hearts were in the right place. But Dad had heard too much truth to be swayed by convenient lies. His voice was steady when he responded, carrying the weight of a man who'd raised children he no longer recognized. Your hearts were in your wallets, not in the right place. Your mother is barely cold in the ground, and you've turned her death into a scheme to steal from your own sister. The confrontation could have continued for hours, but I'd accomplished what I'd come to do. Victoria and Marcus had been exposed for what they really were, not just to me and Dad, but to witnesses who could testify to their behavior if necessary. They'd confessed to their crimes in front of an attorney and a financial advisor, creating a legal record that would be difficult to challenge or explain away. More importantly, Mom's final plan had worked exactly as she'd intended. She'd protected me from their greed, while ensuring that their true nature would be revealed in the most public and undeniable way possible. She'd given me the tools I needed to defend myself and the evidence required to hold them accountable for their actions. As the meeting concluded, and people began gathering their papers and preparing to leave, Victoria made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of her scheme. Danielle, we're still family. We can work this out privately, without involving lawyers or making this into something bigger than it needs to be. I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who shared my DNA but had never really shared my values or my understanding of what family meant. Victoria, we stopped being family the moment you decided to steal from me while I was grieving our mother. Everything that happens next is just consequences. The truth was, there would be consequences, and they would be significant. But for the first time since Mom's death, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what she would have wanted me to do. The game was far from over, but the opening moves had been played, and Victoria and Marcus were no longer controlling the board. The news hit Riverside like a tsunami on Monday morning. I hadn't expected the story to spread so quickly, but small coastal towns have their own ecosystem of information sharing that operates faster than any social media algorithm. By the time I stopped for coffee at Moira's cafe downtown, 3 different people had already approached me with expressions ranging from sympathy to outright curiosity about what they'd heard through the local grapevine. Mrs. Henderson from the post office was the first to corner me, her weathered hands clutching a steaming mug, as she leaned in conspiratorially. Honey, is it true what they're saying about Victoria and Marcus, that they stole your inheritance right from under your nose? The question caught me off guard, not because I was unprepared for public attention, but because I hadn't realized how quickly the details would become common knowledge. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, The Harper family drama was apparently the most interesting thing to happen since the mayor's nephew got arrested for running an illegal cannabis operation out of his food truck. I chose my words carefully, understanding that everything I said would be repeated and embellished with each retelling. There were some discrepancies in how my mother's estate was handled. We're working with attorneys to resolve the situation, but Miss Henderson wasn't satisfied with diplomatic language. Her eyes lit up with the kind of predatory interest that thrives on other people's misfortune. My sister works at the credit union, and she said Victoria came in there acting like she owned the place, demanding access to accounts that weren't even in her name, said she was screaming at poor Angela Foster like it was her fault the paperwork didn't match up. This was news to me. I'd known that Victoria and Marcus would face consequences for their actions, but I hadn't anticipated how quickly those consequences would manifest in public humiliation and professional embarrassment. The image of Victoria losing her composure at the bank, the same composed facade she'd maintained for years finally cracking under pressure, was both satisfying and troubling. By Tuesday, the story had evolved and expanded in ways that reflected both the truth and the community's tendency toward dramatic interpretation. Chloe called me from Portland with updates she'd gathered from her own network of contacts, painting a picture of a scandal that was rapidly becoming the kind of local legend that would be discussed for decades. "Dani, it's everywhere," she said, her voice crackling slightly through the phone connection. "Someone posted about it on the Riverside Community Facebook page, and it's got like 200 comments already. People are sharing stories about their own family inheritance disputes, and half the town is picking sides." The Facebook post, when I finally worked up the courage to read it, was a masterclass in small-town information warfare. It had been written by someone who clearly had access to insider details, but had crafted the narrative to seem like concerned community commentary rather than gossip-mongering. "It's heartbreaking to see what some families go through when money gets involved," the post began innocently enough. "Heard through reliable sources that the Harper family is dealing with some serious issues regarding Linda's estate. Apparently, some of her children thought they could take advantage of the situation while others were too busy grieving to notice. Makes you wonder what people's true priorities really are." The comments section was a battlefield of competing loyalties and moral judgment. Victoria and Marcus had lived in Riverside their entire lives, building relationships and reputations that were now being scrutinized through the lens of their recent behavior. Some commenters defended them, suggesting that inheritance disputes were common, and that outsiders shouldn't judge family decisions they didn't understand. But a surprising number of people shared their own negative experiences with my siblings. Stories that revealed patterns of behavior I'd never known about. "Victoria overcharged my elderly mother for a simple plumbing job last year," wrote someone named Janet Morris. "Said it was family friend pricing, but it was twice what other contractors quoted. Now I'm wondering if that's just how she operates when she thinks people are vulnerable." Another commenter, identifying himself as a former Harper's Hardware employee, shared details about Marcus's business practices that painted a picture of someone who'd been cutting ethical corners long before Mom's death. "He used to sell returned items as new and pocket the difference. Always wondered how he could afford that truck on hardware store profits." Each revelation added another layer to my understanding of who Victoria and Marcus really were beneath their carefully constructed public persona. They weren't just people who'd made poor decisions under stress. They were individuals who'd built their adult lives around taking advantage of others' trust and vulnerability. Mom's death had simply provided them with their biggest opportunity yet. But the social media attention was just the beginning. By Wednesday, I received a call from Detective Sarah Chen at the Riverside Police Department, requesting a meeting to discuss the evidence I'd presented during the estate reading. Her voice was professional but warm, suggesting she understood the sensitive nature of investigating crimes committed within families. "Ms. Harper, I've reviewed the initial report filed by Ms. Brennan regarding potential elder abuse and insurance fraud," she said when we met at the police station later that afternoon. "The evidence you've provided is quite compelling, but I wanted to discuss the various options for how we might proceed." Detective Chen was a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and graying black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her office was organized but lived in, with family photos sharing space with case files and legal references. She had the kind of calm competence that suggested she'd handled plenty of complicated family situations and understood the emotional complexity involved in prosecuting relatives for financial crime. "The recordings your mother made are particularly damaging," she continued, spreading copies of transcripts across her desk. "They show clear intent to defraud and deliberate manipulation of a vulnerable. Combined with the altered insurance documents and the timeline of their claims, we have grounds for multiple felony charges." The word felony hit me like a physical blow. I'd been focused on justice and accountability, but hearing the legal terminology made the potential consequences real in a way they hadn't been before. Victoria and Marcus weren't just facing embarrassment or family estrangement. They were looking at criminal prosecution that could result in significant prison time and permanent criminal records. Detective Chen seemed to understand my internal conflict. "I know this is difficult, especially when you're still grieving your mother's death. Family cases are always the hardest because there's no way to seek justice without causing additional pain to people you care about." Her observation forced me to examine my own motivations more carefully. Did I want Victoria and Marcus prosecuted because they deserved legal consequences for their actions? Or was I simply trying to find a way to make them hurt as much as they'd hurt me? Was my pursuit of justice actually a more sophisticated form of revenge, dressed up in moral language but driven by the same angry impulses I was trying to rise above? What would prosecution actually accomplish? I asked, genuinely unsure of the answer. Would it help anyone besides satisfying my need to see them punished? Detective Chen leaned back in her chair, considering the question with the thoughtfulness of someone who'd asked it many times in her own career. "That's something only you can decide. From a legal perspective, prosecution serves several purposes. It holds people accountable for their actions, it deters similar crimes by others, and it provides official vindication for victims who've been wronged." She paused, studying my face carefully before continuing. "But from a personal perspective, it also means years of legal proceedings, testimony that will be painful for everyone involved, and family relationships that will probably never recover. The question is whether justice is worth the cost of everything else you'll lose in the process." Her honesty was both helpful and overwhelming. I'd been so focused on exposing Victoria and Marcus that I hadn't fully considered what successful prosecution would mean for Dad, for their children, for the extended family members who would be forced to choose sides in a very public legal battle. Justice might be satisfying, but it would also be devastating for innocent people who'd done nothing wrong except love family members who'd turned out to be criminal. That evening I drove to the cemetery where Mom was buried, needing quiet space to think without the constant buzz of phone calls and community speculation. Her grave was still marked only with a temporary placard while we waited for the headstone to be completed, but someone had left fresh flowers, daffodils, her favorite, arranged in a simple glass vase that caught the late afternoon sunlight. I sat on the grass beside her grave, feeling the dampness seep through my jeans as I tried to imagine what she would want me to do with the power her planning had given me. She'd spent years documenting Victoria and Marcus's behavior, building a case that could destroy them completely if I chose to use it. But she'd also been the kind of person who believed in forgiveness and family loyalty, even when that loyalty wasn't reciprocated. "I don't know what you want me to do," I said aloud, feeling slightly foolish but needing to vocalize the conflict that was tearing me apart. "You gave me everything I need to make them pay for what they did, but you also raised me to be better than that. So which is it? Justice or mercy?" The wind rustled through the evergreen trees that bordered the cemetery, carrying the salt scent of the nearby ocean and the green smell of spring growth. Mom didn't answer, of course, but sitting there in the gathering dusk gave me a different perspective on the situation. She hadn't documented Victoria and Marcus's crimes to give me weapons for revenge. She'd done it to give me choices, to ensure that whatever I decided, I would have the power to protect myself and Dad from their future manipulation. The realization shifted something fundamental in my understanding of the situation. I didn't have to choose between justice and mercy. I could use the threat of justice to ensure that mercy was possible without making myself vulnerable to continue to be. Victoria and Marcus had stolen from me because they thought I was powerless to stop them. Now that they knew I wasn't powerless, perhaps they could be convinced to make things right without the nuclear option of criminal prosecution. On Thursday morning, I called Thomas Brennan to discuss the possibility of resolution through civil rather than criminal channels. His response was immediately supportive, suggesting he'd been hoping I would consider alternatives to full prosecution. Family cases are always complicated, he said, echoing Detective Chen's observation. Sometimes the threat of criminal charges is more effective than the charges themselves, especially when the goal is restitution rather than punishment. He outlined a strategy that would accomplish most of what I wanted without the devastating consequences of felony convictions. Victoria and Marcus would be required to return the stolen insurance money, plus interest and legal fee. They would sign admissions of wrongdoing that could be used against them if they ever tried similar schemes in the future. And they would agree to have no involvement in Dad's financial affairs going forward, protecting him from their manipulation while he grieved and adjusted to life without Mom. The key, Brennan explained, is making sure they understand that criminal prosecution remains an option if they don't comply with the civil settlement. The evidence is strong enough that they can't afford to gamble with a jury trial. The settlement proposal was delivered to Victoria and Marcus on Friday morning, exactly 1 week after the estate reading that had exposed their crime. Brennan had crafted the language carefully, making it clear that this was their only opportunity to resolve the situation without facing felony charges that could result in prison time and permanent criminal records. The response came faster than I'd expected. Victoria called me directly that afternoon, her voice stripped of the confident authority she'd wielded for most of our lives. She sounded exhausted and defeated, like someone who'd spent sleepless nights contemplating the destruction of everything she'd built. "Danielle, we need to talk," she said without preamble. "Can you meet us at the house tonight? Marcus and I want to discuss the settlement terms." The Harper family home felt different when I arrived that evening, smaller somehow and filled with shadows that seemed deeper than normal. Dad was there, sitting in his usual recliner but looking older and more fragile than I'd ever seen him. Victoria and Marcus sat on the couch across from him, their body language suggesting they'd been having a difficult conversation before I arrived. Marcus looked up when I entered, his face drawn and pale in a way that made him seem younger despite the circumstances. "Dani, I need you to know that we never meant for things to go this far. We made some bad decisions, but we never wanted to hurt you or Dad." His words might have carried more weight if I hadn't heard Mom's recordings documenting their systematic planning and their callous dismissal of my place in the family. But I could see genuine remorse in his expression, the kind of regret that comes from finally understanding the true cost of your actions. Victoria was harder to read, her face carefully composed despite the obvious strain she was under. "We've talked to our attorney and we understand the seriousness of the charges we're facing. We're prepared to accept the settlement terms, but we wanted to ask if there's any way to keep this from becoming public record." Her question revealed what she was really worried about, not the financial consequences of returning the stolen money, but the social and professional damage that would result from public acknowledgement of their crime. Victoria had built her identity around being the responsible older sister, the successful businesswoman, the devoted mother who always made the right choices. Having that image destroyed by criminal charges or even civil settlements would be devastating to her sense of self. I found myself in the strange position of holding my siblings' futures in my hands, knowing that my decision would determine whether they faced public humiliation and professional ruin, or simply had to return money they'd never had a right to claim in the first place. The power was intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. "The settlement can include confidentiality provisions," I said carefully, "but there are limits to what can be kept private. The criminal investigation is already a matter of public record, and Detective Chen has to file reports regardless of whether we proceed with prosecution." Dad spoke for the first time since I'd arrived, his voice heavy with disappointment that went beyond anything related to money or legal consequences. "I don't understand how we got here. I don't understand how my own children could do something like this to each other while their mother was barely in the ground." His pain was perhaps the most devastating consequence of Victoria and Marcus's action. They'd stolen money from me, but they'd stolen something more precious from him. His faith in the family he'd spent decades building and his belief that his children shared the values he'd tried to instill in them. Victoria broke down then, the careful composure she'd maintained finally cracking under the weight of Dad's disappointment. "We thought we were being practical," she sobbed. "The hardware store is struggling, and I have college expenses coming up for the kids. We thought Danielle was doing well enough that she wouldn't miss the money, and we were trying to protect the family assets." Her explanation revealed the fundamental selfishness that had driven their action. They'd convinced themselves that their needs were more important than honesty, that their financial struggles justified stealing from their own sister, that they had the right to make decisions about Mom's money based on their own assessment of who deserved what. Marcus tried a different approach, appealing directly to family loyalty in a way that might have been effective if he hadn't already demonstrated how little that loyalty meant to him. "We're still family, Dani. Whatever mistakes we've made, we're still your brother and sister. Isn't there some way we can work this out without destroying everything?" The irony of his plea wasn't lost on me. He was asking for the same family loyalty they'd denied me when they decided to steal my inheritance, the same consideration they'd refused to show when they were planning their scheme while I was grieving Mom's death. But family loyalty, real family loyalty, sometimes meant holding people accountable for their actions rather than enabling their bad behavior. "You can start by returning every penny you stole," I said quietly. "Then you can sign documents admitting what you did and agreeing never to manipulate Dad's finances or try anything like this again. And then you can hope that someday I might be able to forgive you for using Mom's death as an opportunity to steal from me." The negotiations continued for another hour, with Brennan joining us by phone to work out the specific terms of the settlement. Victoria and Marcus would return the full $75,000 from the insurance policy, plus 8% annual interest calculated from the date they'd claimed the fund. They would also pay my legal fees and agree to a detailed admission of wrongdoing that could be used against them if they ever violated the terms of the agreement. Most importantly, they would surrender any claims to involvement in Dad's financial affairs and agree to regular oversight of their own business practices to ensure they weren't victimizing other vulnerable community members. The settlement was comprehensive and punitive without being vindictive, designed to provide justice while preserving the possibility of eventual family reconciliation. But even as we worked out the details, I could see the resentment building in Victoria's eyes. The kind of anger that comes from being forced to face consequences you never expected to encounter. She was complying with the settlement terms because she had no choice, not because she genuinely understood the enormity of what she'd done or felt authentic remorse for her actions. Marcus seemed more genuinely affected by the situation, his shoulders sagging with the weight of shame and regret. "I never wanted it to be like this," he said, as the meeting concluded. "I just wanted to take care of my family and I thought there was enough money that nobody would really get hurt." His words revealed the dangerous logic that had led to this moment, the belief that theft isn't really theft if you convince yourself the victim won't be seriously harmed, that family bonds can survive any betrayal as long as the motivation is financial necessity rather than simple greed. It was the kind of thinking that allowed good people to do terrible things while maintaining their self-image as moral individuals. As I drove home that night, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just 3 weeks. I'd gone from being the grieving daughter who was too devastated to notice being robbed, to someone who held the power to destroy or redeem the siblings who'd betrayed me. The transformation was both empowering and exhausting, requiring emotional strength I hadn't known I possessed. The settlement would be finalized within the week, returning the stolen money and providing legal protections against future manipulation. Detective Chen would close her investigation without filing charges, though the evidence would remain on file in case Victoria or Marcus ever engaged in similar behavior. And Dad would be protected from their schemes while maintaining relationships with his older children, assuming they could rebuild the trust they'd shattered through their greed and deception. But the real victory wasn't financial or legal. It was the knowledge that Mom's final act of love and protection had succeeded exactly as she'd planned. She'd given me the tools I needed to defend myself and the wisdom to use those tools with restraint rather than vengeance. She'd turned her own victimization into my empowerment, ensuring that her death wouldn't mark the end of justice in our family but the beginning of accountability. The phone calls and media attention would continue for a while, the small-town gossip mill would find new scandals to dissect, and the Harper family would have to find a way to function with relationships fundamentally altered by betrayal and consequence. But for the first time since Mom's death, I felt like I was standing on solid ground, protected by truth and strengthened by the knowledge that I was exactly who she'd raised me to be. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new house, watching the morning fog roll in from the Pacific as I sipped coffee that was still hot enough to warm my hands through the ceramic mug. The house was a modest craftsman bungalow about 20 minutes north of Riverside, close enough to visit Dad regularly but far enough away to establish my own space, my own life, my own definition of what home could be when it wasn't built on compromises and careful silences. The money from Mom's investment accounts had made the down payment possible, along with enough left over to create the kind of financial security I'd been working toward for years. But more than the house itself, what I treasured was the knowledge that every room, every choice, every small decision about paint colors and furniture placement was entirely mine. No family politics to navigate, no inherited tensions to manage, just the quiet satisfaction of building something that reflected who I was, rather than who others expected me to be. Dad had been my first visitor, arriving with a toolbox and an eagerness to help that reminded me of weekend projects from my childhood, back when our family felt solid and uncomplicated. His arthritis made detailed work difficult, but he'd insisted on installing the new mailbox and adjusting the front door so it closed properly. Working with his hands seemed to give him peace in a way that conversation couldn't, a return to the simple satisfaction of fixing things that were actually fixable. "Your mother would have loved this place," he'd said, standing back to admire the herb garden I'd planted along the south-facing wall. She always talked about having a house where she could grow her own basil and not worry about the deer getting into it. His comment had brought tears I wasn't expecting, not from sadness but from gratitude that he could mention Mom without the bitterness that had characterized so many of our conversations over the past month. The settlement had been finalized, the money returned and the legal protections put in place, but healing the emotional damage had taken much longer and required different kinds of work. Victoria and Marcus had both moved away from Riverside within 3 months of the settlement. Victoria relocated her family to Salem, claiming her husband had gotten a better job opportunity, though everyone understood she was really fleeing the social consequences of her action. The story had become part of local folklore, the kind of cautionary tale people shared when discussing inheritance planning or family trust issues. Her children, innocent victims of their mother's poor choices, would grow up in a new community where their family name wasn't associated with scandal and betrayal. Marcus had sold his share of Harper's hardware to Dad's former partner and moved to Eugene, where he'd taken a job managing inventory for a small chain of garden centers. Dad had mentioned receiving occasional emails from him, awkward messages that tried to maintain some connection without acknowledging the fundamental breach of trust that made normal family relationships impossible. The attempts at communication seemed to cause Dad more pain than comfort, reminders of what had been lost rather than hope for what might be rebuilt. The settlement money had arrived via certified check on a gray Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who'd handled the transaction with the efficient indifference of someone who'd seen plenty of family financial disputes. $75,000 plus interest and legal fees, exactly as stipulated in the agreement. But holding that check felt nothing like victory. It felt like closing a chapter of my life that should never have needed to be written. I deposited the money immediately, not wanting it to sit around as a tangible reminder of everything that had been broken in pursuit of it. Part went toward the house down payment, part into conservative investments that Patricia Wells helped me select, and part into a college fund I'd started for Victoria's children. They deserved better than to be punished for their mother's choices, and education was the kind of gift that couldn't be stolen or corrupted by family politics. The college fund had been my decision alone, made without consulting Dad or discussing it with anyone else who might have opinions about whether Victoria's children deserved help from the aunt they'd been taught to see as distant and selfish. But Mom's voice in my head had been clear on this point. Children shouldn't suffer for their parents' failures, and education was too important to be held hostage by adult grudges and resentments. Mrs. Dorothy Kim had become an unexpected source of comfort during those first difficult months. Our elderly neighbor had started stopping by with homemade soup and stories about Mom that I'd never heard before, filling in details about her daily life that helped me understand the woman she'd been beyond her role as my mother. Their friendship had been deeper and more honest than I'd realized, built on shared morning walks and quiet conversations about everything from neighborhood gossip to existential questions about aging and mortality. "Your mother was worried about you," Miss Kim had told me one afternoon, as we sat on her front porch drinking iced tea and watching the neighborhood kids ride bikes in lazy circles around the cul-de-sac. "Not because she thought you couldn't take care of yourself, but because she knew you were so focused on taking care of everyone else that you might forget to build a life that made you happy." The observation had hit deeper than I expected, revealing a truth about my patterns that I'd been too close to see clearly. I had spent most of my adult life trying to prove my worth through achievement and selflessness, working long hours and sacrificing personal relationships to build a career that would make my family proud and demonstrate that I wasn't the selfish, distant daughter Victoria and Marcus had painted me as being. But Mom hadn't wanted me to prove anything to anyone. She'd wanted me to be happy, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation, to create a life that felt authentic rather than performative. The money she'd left me wasn't just financial security, it was permission to stop trying so hard to earn love from people who'd already decided I wasn't worth loving. Chloe had been instrumental in helping me navigate the emotional complexity of starting over. She'd driven down from Portland almost every weekend during those first few months, bringing takeout food and wine and the kind of unconditional friendship that doesn't require explanations or justification. She'd also been brutally honest about patterns in my behavior that might have contributed to the family dynamics, helping me understand the difference between being genuinely excluded and participating in my own marginalization. "You've spent years accepting crumbs and calling it love," she'd said during one particularly difficult conversation. "Your family trained you to expect so little that when they gave you nothing, you thought it was normal, but you deserve more than normal, Dan. You deserve actual love, not the performance of family obligation." Her words had forced me to examine not just what Victoria and Marcus had done to me, but what I'd allowed them to do, the ways I'd enabled their dismissive treatment by accepting it as the price of belonging to a family that had never really wanted me as an equal member. The realization was painful but liberating, helping me understand that building authentic relationships would require different skills and different expectations than I'd developed during my childhood. Work had become a different kind of challenge as word of the inheritance drama spread through my professional network. Some colleagues had been sympathetic and supportive, sharing their own stories of family financial disputes and offering advice about managing sudden wealth responsibly. But others had treated me with the kind of awkward curiosity that suggested they saw me as a character in a soap opera rather than a real person dealing with genuine loss and betrayal. The promotion I'd been working toward had materialized 3 months after the settlement, partly due to my proven skills but also, I suspected, because my supervisor wanted to demonstrate that the company valued employees who stood up for themselves in difficult circumstances. The title came with a significant salary increase and the kind of professional respect I'd been chasing for years, but it felt different than I'd expected, less like validation and more like natural recognition of work I'd been doing well all along. The new position also came with the flexibility to work remotely several days a week, which meant I could spend more time in my own house, in my own community, building relationships that weren't filtered through family expectations or professional networking requirements. I joined a book club at the local library, started volunteering at the animal shelter where Mom had spent so many Saturday mornings, and even begun dating someone I'd met through a hiking group that explored the coastal trails every weekend. David was a marine biologist who worked for the state environmental agency, studying water quality and salmon populations along the Oregon coast. He was quiet and thoughtful, the kind of person who found beauty in data patterns and ecosystem relationships that most people never noticed. He'd never heard of the Harper family drama when we met, which meant our relationship could develop without the weight of my story overshadowing every conversation. "You're different than you think you are," he'd told me after we'd been dating for 2 months, sitting on a driftwood log and watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and amber. "You talk about yourself like you're damaged goods, but I see someone who survived something that would have destroyed a lot of people and came out stronger instead of bitter," His perspective helped me recognize progress I'd been too close to see. The woman who'd discovered her inheritance had been stolen was not the same person who was building a new life 6 months later. I'd learned to trust my own judgment, to value my own needs, to build boundaries that protected my energy and emotional well-being rather than simply trying to keep peace with people who didn't respect me anyway. The most unexpected development had been reconnecting with extended family members who'd been kept at arm's length by Victoria and Marcus over the years. Cousins and aunts who'd always seemed distant had reached out after hearing about the inheritance situation, sharing their own experiences with my siblings' manipulation and expressing regret about not speaking up sooner about behaviors they'd witnessed, but dismissed as family quirk. Aunt Sarah, Mom's younger sister who lived in California, had been particularly revelatory. She'd called 2 months after the settlement to apologize for not maintaining closer contact and to share stories about conversations she'd had with Mom over the years regarding concerns about Victoria and Marcus's treatment of me. Linda was always worried that they were pushing you away, Aunt Sarah had explained during a long phone conversation that stretched well into the evening. She tried to talk to them about including you more, but they always had excuses about why you were too busy or too successful to need family support. She knew they were lying to themselves about your situation, but she didn't know how to fix it without making things worse. These conversations had helped me understand that my sense of being excluded hadn't been paranoid or oversensitive. It had been an accurate perception of deliberate behavior that other family members had noticed, but felt powerless to address. Mom had been fighting for my place in the family long before her final illness, trying to bridge gaps that Victoria and Marcus had been actively working to widen. The anniversary of Mom's death had approached with less dread than I'd expected. Instead of the crushing grief that had characterized the first few months after her passing, I felt a different kind of sadness, one that included gratitude for what she'd given me and acceptance of what had been lost. I'd spent the day at the cemetery not just visiting her grave but walking through the older sections, reading headstones and thinking about all the families who'd faced similar challenges over the generation. Dad had joined me for dinner that evening, bringing takeout from the Chinese restaurant Mom had loved and a bottle of wine she'd been saving for a special occasion that never came. We'd eaten in comfortable silence, sharing memories that felt precious rather than painful, talking about her garden and her terrible singing voice, and the way she'd always burned the edges of chocolate chip cookies, but claimed it made them taste better. "She'd be proud of you," he'd said as we cleaned up the dishes, his voice matter-of-fact rather than sentimental, not because of the money or the house or any of that external stuff, but because you figured out how to be yourself instead of who everyone else wanted you to be. His words had carried weight because they came from genuine observation rather than obligation. Dad had watched me navigate the inheritance crisis and its aftermath with a kind of quiet amazement, seeing me demonstrate strength and wisdom he hadn't known I possessed. Our relationship had deepened through shared disappointment in Victoria and Marcus, but more importantly through mutual respect that had been building since I'd stood up for myself in ways he'd never seen before. The settlement documentation had been filed away in a fireproof safe, along with Mom's original recordings and Patricia Wells' investment records. I didn't look at those papers often, but knowing they existed provided a sense of security that went beyond their legal protection. They were proof that I'd been loved unconditionally by someone who understood my worth even when I struggled to see it myself. Victoria and Marcus had become cautionary tales in my mind rather than sources of active anger. Their choices had revealed character flaws that would likely continue to create problems in their new communities, with new victims who didn't have the benefit of family knowledge or documented evidence to protect themselves. I occasionally wondered if they'd learned anything from the consequences they'd faced, or if they simply viewed the entire situation as an unfortunate series of events that had derailed their rightful inheritance. But their futures weren't my responsibility anymore. I'd given them opportunities to make things right, held them accountable for their actions, and protected Dad from their continued manipulation. The rest of their character development would have to happen without my involvement or concern, freeing me to focus on relationships and activities that actually enriched my life rather than draining my energy. The house had become a symbol of everything I'd gained through the painful process of family disintegration and reconstruction. Each room represented choices I'd made independently, investments in my own comfort and happiness, rather than attempts to please or impress other people. The kitchen where I'd learned to make Mom's recipes, the office where I worked on projects that mattered to me, the bedroom that was decorated exactly to my taste, without consideration for anyone else's preferences. But more than the physical space, what I treasured was the peace that came from living authentically. No more walking on eggshells around people who were looking for reasons to criticize me. No more exhausting myself trying to prove my worth to family members who'd already decided I wasn't worth their respect or inclusion. No more accepting less than I deserved, and calling it love. Standing in my kitchen on that foggy morning watching the world wake up outside my window, I felt something I'd never experienced before, complete contentment with who I was and what I'd built. The inheritance drama had been devastating and painful, but it had also been clarifying, stripping away illusions and false loyalties to reveal what actually mattered and who actually cared. Mom's final gift hadn't been money or property or even justice for past wrong. It had been the knowledge that I was worthy of protection, worthy of love, worthy of fighting for even when the people who should have been fighting for me had chosen to fight against me instead. She'd given me permission to value myself as highly as she'd valued me, to build a life based on my own dreams, rather than other people's expectations. The phone rang as I finished my coffee, interrupting my morning meditation with the familiar sound of connection and possibility. It was David, calling to confirm our plans for hiking that afternoon and to share something interesting he'd discovered about tide pool ecosystems during his research. His voice carried the kind of enthusiasm that reminded me there were still discoveries to be made, adventures to be shared, love to be built with people who chose to see the best in me, rather than searching for reasons to dismiss. I smiled as I answered, looking out at the garden where Mom's favorite flowers were beginning to bloom in soil that belonged entirely to me. The past would always be part of my story, but it no longer defined my future. I'd learned to honor what was worth preserving while releasing what needed to be let go, building something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The woman who'd been stolen from while grieving her mother's death was gone, replaced by someone stronger and wiser and infinitely more selective about who deserved access to her heart. It had been an expensive education, paid for with family relationships and naive trust, but the lessons learned were worth more than any inheritance could ever be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.